I stood at the altar in my wedding dress, watching my sister Melody cry crocodile tears as she clung to my fiance's arm. The entire church gasped as James pulled away from me and turned to face our guests. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said, his voice carrying across the silent sanctuary. "I can't marry you. I love Melody. I always have." The bouquet slipped from my trembling hands, white roses scattering across the marble floor. But this time, I wasn't devastated. This time, I was prepared. Because I had lived through this exact moment before. In my previous life, this betrayal had destroyed me. I had run from the church sobbing, humiliated in front of 300 guests, including every important family in our social circle. I had spent years trying to rebuild my shattered reputation while James and Melody lived happily as the golden couple everyone adored. But now, watching Melody's perfectly practiced performance of reluctant love and James's Oscar-worthy portrayal of a conflicted groom, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "I understand," I said quietly, my voice steady. The church felt even more silent. They had expected hysterics, not this calm acceptance. "If you truly love each other, then you should be together." Melody's eyes flickered with confusion for just a moment. This wasn't how I had reacted last time. "However," I continued, turning to address the congregation, "since we have all gathered here today for a wedding, and since this church is already paid for—" I paused, letting my gaze drift to where Alexander Whitmore sat in his wheelchair in the back row, just as I knew he would be. Perhaps we shouldn't let it go to waste. The man who was supposed to be dying, the man everyone pitied, the man my sister had callously abandoned for my fiancé. He was staring at me with the most interesting expression. Last time, I had barely noticed him. This time, I knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. "Alexander," I called out, my voice carrying clearly through the church, "would you do me the honor of becoming my husband instead?" The gasps that rippled through the congregation were nothing compared to the look of absolute horror that flashed across Melody's face before she quickly masked it with fake concern. "Elena, you can't be serious," she whispered urgently. He's dying." I smiled then, the same serene smile I had perfected over the past 6 months since my rebirth. "Then I suppose we shouldn't waste any time." 6 months ago, I had opened my eyes in my childhood bedroom and nearly screamed. The last thing I remembered from my previous life was the car accident. The same car accident that had killed me at age 32, alone and bitter, after years of watching my sister live the life that should have been mine. The pink wallpaper, the stuffed animals, the acceptance letter to Stanford Law School lying on my desk. Everything was exactly as it had been when I was 23. Somehow, impossibly, I had been given a second chance. It had taken me 3 days to fully accept the reality of my situation. 3 days of testing whether my memories of the future were accurate. They were. Every stock tip, every news event, every family secret I remembered came to pass exactly as I recalled. But more importantly, I remembered the truth about my family that I'd been too naive to see the first time around. My sister Melody wasn't the sweet, innocent girl everyone believed her to be. She was a master manipulator who had spent our entire lives systematically destroying my relationships, my opportunities, and my self-worth. She had stolen my college boyfriend by claiming I had cheated on him with his roommate, a lie she maintained with fake photos she had carefully staged. She had sabotaged my internship at our father's company by spreading rumors about my mental instability after our mother's death. She had even convinced our grief-stricken father to give her my mother's jewelry collection, claiming that Mom had promised it to her in her final moments, and James, my perfect fiancé James, had been in on it from the beginning. He had pursued me at Melody's requests, a long-term plan to humiliate me as publicly as possible. In my previous life, I had only learned this truth years later when I overheard them laughing about it at a charity gala, completely unaware that I was standing behind a pillar, invisible as always. The most devastating revelation had been about my mother's death. In my previous life, I had always believed she died from complications during routine surgery. It was only after I died and met her in what I can only describe as a peaceful in-between space that she told me the truth. Melody had switched her medication the night before her surgery, replacing her blood thinners with sugar pills. The surgery complications weren't random, they were murder. My mother had chosen to send me back to give me the knowledge I needed to expose the truth and get justice for both of us. But this time, I had a plan that went far beyond simple revenge. Alexander Whitmore was the key to everything. In my previous life, I had barely paid attention to him. He was Melody's fiance, a quiet man in a wheelchair who everyone assumed was dying from some rare genetic condition. Melody had gotten engaged to him for his family's pharmaceutical fortune, then promptly began her affair with James the moment she realized she could have both money and the man she actually wanted. What no one knew, what I only learned in my previous life when his miraculous recovery made international headlines, was that Alexander wasn't dying at all. He had been deliberately poisoned slowly and systematically by someone close to him, someone who had access to his food and medication, someone who stood to inherit his fortune if he died before producing an heir, someone like a devoted fiance who had studied biochemistry at Stanford. In my previous life, it had taken Alexander's private investigators 3 years to prove that Melody had been poisoning him. By then, she was already married to James and living off the settlement from their quiet divorce. Alexander had been too weak to pursue her criminally, and the evidence was circumstantial enough that she faced no real consequences. But this time, I was going to make sure things went very differently. This time, I had spent the last 6 months carefully positioning myself to be exactly where I needed to be. I had cultivated a friendship with Alexander's sister Catherine, volunteering at the children's hospital where she worked. I had accidentally run into Alexander at the coffee shop near his doctor's office, bringing him herbal tea blends that I claimed helped with fatigue. Teas that were actually full of antioxidants and natural detoxifiers that would help counteract whatever Melody was giving him. Most importantly, I had been documenting everything. Every time Melody visited Alexander, every meal she brought him, every medication change she suggested to his doctors. I had camera equipment set up in places she would never think to look, and I had been building a case that would destroy her completely. But first, I needed to make sure Alexander survived long enough for his recovery to be undeniable. And I needed to secure my own position before Melody realized what was happening. The decision to marry Alexander had been forming in my mind for weeks, but it crystallized the moment I saw James and Melody's plan in action. They thought they were so clever, staging their sudden realization of love just moments before our wedding. They wanted maximum humiliation, maximum drama, maximum damage to my reputation. Instead, I was going to give them something they never saw coming. Standing in that church, watching the confusion and calculation flickering across Melody's face, as she tried to figure out how to respond to my proposal to Alexander, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. This was the moment everything changed. "Elena!" My father's voice cut through the murmur of the congregation as he approached from the front row. "Sweetheart, you're in shock. You can't make decisions like this when you're upset." I turned to him with the same serene smile I had been practicing. "I'm not upset, Daddy. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years." "But Alexander is." He gestured helplessly toward the back of the church. "His condition is improving daily," I said firmly. It wasn't true yet, but it would be soon enough. "And regardless, shouldn't love be about supporting each other through sickness and health? Isn't that what wedding vows are for?" I could see the wheels turning in my father's head. He had always been a pragmatic man, and the Whitmore pharmaceutical fortune was nothing to dismiss lightly. Even if Alexander only lived another year, I would be a very wealthy widow. If he recovered, which my father couldn't possibly know was likely, I would be one of the most powerful women in the state. "Elena?" Melody's voice was strained now, her perfect composure starting to crack. "You can't just— You barely know him." "I know him better than you think," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "And I know exactly what kind of man he is." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. Melody's face went pale, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what I might know and how much danger she was in. But before she could formulate a response, Alexander himself spoke from his position near the back of the church. "I would be honored to accept your proposal, Elena." His voice was weak but clear, carrying just enough strength to reach every ear in the sanctuary. "If you're certain this is what you want." I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I said. And for the first time since my rebirth, I was telling the complete truth. The next hour was a blur of frantic activity. The minister, clearly overwhelmed by the situation, agreed to perform the ceremony after a whispered conversation with my father, who, I suspected, was already calculating the business advantages of an alliance with the Whitmore family. Melody and James were trapped in their role as the star-crossed lovers, unable to object too strongly without revealing their true motivations. They could only stand by and watch as their carefully laid plans crumbled around them. As I walked down the aisle toward Alexander, I caught sight of my reflection in the church's stained glass windows. I looked radiant, confident, powerful. Everything I had never been in my previous life. If for the first time since my rebirth, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But the real victory wasn't in marrying Alexander, though I was already growing genuinely fond of his quiet intelligence and dry humor. The real victory was in what came next. Because while everyone was focused on the drama of the moment, I had been implementing the second phase of my plan. The private investigator I had hired was already in position outside the church, ready to serve Melody with a warrant for her DNA and medical records. The district attorney's office had received an anonymous tip about suspicious medical purchases made with Melody's credit card, and, most importantly, the special blend of herbal tea I had been giving Alexander was about to start showing its true effects. The poison that had been slowly killing him was finally being flushed from his system. Within days, his strength would begin returning. Within weeks, he would be walking again. And when he stood up in front of everyone who believed he was dying, especially in front of the woman who had been trying to kill him, the real reckoning would begin. The first sign that my plan was working came just 3 days after the wedding. I was having breakfast with Alexander in the sunroom of his estate, our estate now, when he suddenly looked up from his newspaper with the brightest expression I had seen on his face since my rebirth. "Elena," he said, his voice stronger than it had been the week before. I think I feel better." I set down my coffee cup and tried to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "The fatigue that has been plaguing me for months, it's lifting. And the pain in my joints, it's almost gone." He flexed his fingers experimentally, and I could see the wonder in his eyes. "Do you think it's possible that whatever was making me sick is finally running its course?" "Anything is possible," I said carefully. "Have you mentioned this to Dr. Morrison?" "I have an appointment with him this afternoon. He's going to run some blood work." Alexander reached across the table and took my hand, his grip noticeably firmer than it had been on our wedding day. "Elena, I need you to know, if I am getting better, if we're going to have more time together than either of us expected, I want to make sure you know this wasn't just a marriage of convenience for me." I squeezed his hand gently. Over the past few days, I had discovered that Alexander was everything I had hoped he would be. Intelligent, kind, genuinely funny when he wasn't exhausted from fighting whatever poison was in his system. In my previous life, I had been too blinded by my obsession with James to see what was right in front of me. "It wasn't just convenience for me either," I admitted. "I know the circumstances were unusual, but I'm glad we're married, Alexander, whatever happens next." What happened next was a phone call from Dr. Morrison that evening. "The blood work is remarkable, Alexander." The doctor's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "Whatever was causing your condition appears to be clearing your system rapidly. Your liver function is normalizing, your white blood cell count is stable, and most importantly, the cellular damage we've been monitoring is actually reversing itself." Alexander looked at me with something close to amazement. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that if this trend continues, you could be looking at a full recovery within the next few months. I want to run more comprehensive tests, but Alexander, I think you're going to be fine." The moment we hung up the phone, Alexander turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Elena, do you realize what this means? We're going to have a life together, a real life." I kissed him then, and for the first time since my rebirth, I felt genuinely happy rather than just satisfied with my revenge plans. But the happiness was interrupted by an urgent knocking at the front door. Catherine Whitmore, Alexander's sister, practically flew into the room when the housekeeper let her in. Alex, thank God you're both here. We need to talk immediately. Catherine, what's wrong? Alexander started to stand from his wheelchair, then caught himself with a look of surprise. I I almost just stood up without thinking about it. That's exactly what we need to discuss. Catherine's face was grim as she took a seat across from us. Alex, I got a call from Detective Rodriguez this afternoon. They're opening an investigation into your illness. An investigation? I asked, though I already knew exactly what was happening. What kind of investigation? They think someone has been poisoning you, Alex, deliberately. They have evidence of suspicious purchases made by someone with access to your medication and food. Catherine's eyes were bright with anger. They think someone close to you has been trying to kill you. Alexander went very still. Someone close to me. The detective said they received an anonymous tip with documentation going back months. Photographs, receipts, medical records showing that your symptoms match a specific type of slow-acting toxin. Catherine reached across and took her brother's hand. Alex, they think it was Melody. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Alexander's mind working, processing the implications, remembering every meal Melody had brought him, every time she had insisted on preparing his medication herself, every moment when she had claimed to be caring for him while actually slowly killing him. She's been poisoning me, he said quietly. All this time, while she was pretending to love me, planning our wedding, she was trying to murder me. The worst part is, Catherine continued, they think she's been doing it for over a year. Your condition didn't progress naturally, Alex. Someone has been deliberately making you sicker and sicker, probably planning to let you die right after the wedding so she could inherit everything. Alexander's grip on my hand tightened. Elena, if I hadn't married you instead, if I had gone through with marrying Melody, you'd be dead within 6 months, Catherine finished grimly. The detective said the concentration of toxins in your system suggests she was planning to finish the job soon. Where is she now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. That's the other thing, Catherine said. When the police went to question her this morning, she was already gone. She and James packed up everything and left town sometime during the night. They cleaned out her bank accounts and just disappeared. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Elena, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. My heart began to race. What is it? That day at the church, when you proposed to me, did you know? About the poisoning? About what Melody was doing to me? I had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed exactly what I would say if Alexander ever figured out that my knowledge of the situation was more than coincidental. But looking into his eyes, I realized I didn't want to lie to him anymore. Yes, I said quietly. I knew. How? I took a deep breath. It's a long story, and I'm not sure you'll believe me, but I had been watching her, Alexander. I suspected she wasn't who she pretended to be, and I hired a private investigator to look into her background. The evidence of the poisoning was part of what he found. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was close enough, and it was believable in a way that I was reborn with memories from a previous life would never be. So, when you proposed to me at the church, Alexander said slowly, I was saving your life, I finished, and maybe saving my own in the process. Catherine was staring at us both with something approaching awe. Elena, do you realize that you stopped a murder? If Alex had married Melody, if she had been able to continue poisoning him, I realize, I said quietly, and I'd do it again. Alexander lifted our joined hands to his lips and kissed my knuckles gently. Then I owe you everything, my life, my future, my happiness, all of it. Actually, I said with a small smile, I think we're even. You gave me something too, Alexander. You gave me the chance to be the person I was meant to be instead of the victim I used to be. But our moment of connection was interrupted by the ringing of Alexander's phone. The caller ID showed Detective Rodriguez. Mr. Whitmore. The detective's voice was urgent when Alexander answered. I need to inform you that we've issued warrants for Melody Harrison and James Parker. They're wanted for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. But more importantly, we have reason to believe they might try to come back for you. Come back? Why would they do that? Because your recovery is going to ruin everything for them. If you get better, when you get better, it proves their plan failed. And desperate people do desperate things. The detective's voice was grim. Mr. Whitmore, I think you and your wife should consider going somewhere safe until we can apprehend them. Alexander looked at me. Elena, I won't put you in danger because of my problems with our problems, I corrected firmly. We're married, remember? Your problems are my problems now. But even as I spoke, I felt a cold thrill of anticipation. Because if Melody and James were desperate enough to come back, if they were going to make one last attempt to salvage their plan, then I was going to be ready for them. And this time, I was going to make sure they never had the chance to hurt anyone ever again. The final confrontation I had been planning for 6 months was finally about to begin. 2 weeks later, I stood on the terrace of our estate, watching my husband walk through the gardens below. Alexander's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The doctors were calling it one of the most remarkable cases they had ever seen, a complete reversal of what had appeared to be a terminal condition. What they didn't know was that I had been documenting every step of his recovery, building a medical timeline that would serve as undeniable proof of exactly when the poisoning had stopped and the healing had begun. The evidence was overwhelming, and it painted a very clear picture of Melody's guilt. The sound of footsteps on the terrace stairs made me turn. Alexander approached with 2 cups of coffee and the morning newspaper, moving with the confident stride of a man who had never been sick at all. "Any word from Detective Rodriguez?" he asked, handing me my coffee. "He called an hour ago. They found Melody and James in Mexico, trying to access an offshore account that James set up, with money he embezzled from his law firm." I took a sip of coffee and smiled. Apparently, Melody had been skimming from her trust fund for months to pay for the poisons she was using on you. When they ran out of money, James got desperate and started stealing from his clients. Alexander shook his head in amazement. I still can't believe I was so blind to what she was doing. She was very good at hiding it. And you trusted her because you're a good person who doesn't expect the people you love to try to murder you. I reached over and took his hand. That's not a character flaw, Alexander. That's what makes you worthy of being loved. Speaking of being loved, Alexander said with a grin that was becoming more frequent as his health returned, I have some news that I think will make you very happy. Oh? My lawyer called this morning. The DA's office has officially charged Melody with attempted murder in the 1st degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. The evidence you helped gather, all those photographs and documents, it's enough to put her away for the rest of her life. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. And James? Embezzlement, conspiracy, and accessory to attempted murder. He's looking at 20 years minimum. Alexander squeezed my hand. Elena, they're never going to be able to hurt anyone ever again. Good, I said simply. There's more. Alexander's smile widened. Catherine talked to the district attorney yesterday. Because of the severity of the case and the overwhelming evidence, they're recommending that both Melody and James be denied bail. They're going to remain in custody until trial. Which means they're going to have plenty of time to think about what they did. And they're going to spend that time knowing that not only did their plan fail completely, but that you outsmarted them at every turn. Alexander lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it gently. My brilliant, beautiful wife, who saved my life and destroyed my enemies all at the same time. I laughed, feeling genuinely lighthearted for the first time in either of my lives. When you put it like that, it sounds like something out of a fairy tale. The best fairy tales always involve the villain getting their comeuppance, Alexander said. And in this case, justice has definitely been served. We stood together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun set over the gardens. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice more serious. Elena, I need to ask you something. Anything. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me instead of fighting for James? I know you loved him once. I turned to look at my husband, really look at him. In the golden light of the setting sun, he was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with strength of character. He was kind, intelligent, genuinely funny, and absolutely devoted to me. More importantly, he was alive, healthy, and free from the poison that had been slowly killing him. Alexander, I said quietly, I need to tell you something. I never loved James. Not really. I loved the idea of him, the fantasy of what I thought he represented, but I didn't know him at all. And me? You, I know. I know that you read 3 newspapers every morning because you think it's important to stay informed. I know that you donate anonymously to 12 different charities because you believe wealth comes with responsibility. I know that you talk to the gardener's children in Spanish because you think it's important that they feel welcomed in your home. I smiled. I know that you're exactly the kind of man I should have been looking for all along. Alexander's eyes were bright as he pulled me closer. I love you, Elena Whitmore. I love you too, Alexander Whitmore. As we kissed on the terrace of our beautiful home, I could hear my phone buzzing with a text message. I ignored it at first, but Alexander pulled back with a gentle laugh. You should check that. It might be important. I glanced at the screen and felt my smile widen. The message was from my father. Elena, I just heard about Melody's arrest on the news. I need to apologize for not seeing what she was really like. You've always been the stronger of my daughters, and I should have recognized that years ago. I'm proud of you. Love, Dad? Good news, Alexander asked. The best, I said, showing him the message. It looks like everyone is finally seeing Melody for who she really is. And seeing you for who you really are, too. That, too. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching Melody and James receive their sentences. Melody looked pale and thin in her orange jumpsuit, nothing like the vibrant, manipulative woman who had tormented me in my previous life. James looked broken, defeated, like a man who had finally realized the cost of his choices. When the judge sentenced Melody to life in prison without the possibility of parole, I felt a sense of closure that went beyond simple revenge. Justice had been served not just for me, but for Alexander, and for every person Melody might have hurt in the future if she had been allowed to continue her pattern of manipulation and destruction. As we left the courthouse, Alexander, walking steadily beside me, without even the hint of the weakness that had once confined him to a wheelchair, I reflected on how different my life had become. I had a loving husband, a comfortable home, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using a second chance to right the wrongs of the past. But most importantly, I had learned something I had never understood in my previous life. The best revenge isn't just about making your enemies suffer. The best revenge is building a life so wonderful, so full of love and happiness and success, that their attempts to destroy you become irrelevant. Melody and James had tried to ruin me, but instead they had given me everything I had ever wanted. They had pushed me toward the man I was meant to be with, shown me my own strength, and provided me with the motivation to become the person I was always capable of being. 1 year after our wedding, Alexander and I renewed our vows in the same church where we had first been married. This time there was no drama, no last-minute betrayals, no desperate schemes. There was only love, joy, and the quiet satisfaction of 2 people who had found their way to exactly where they belonged. As I walked down the aisle toward my husband, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the stained glass windows again. I looked radiant, powerful, completely at peace with myself and my choices. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could almost hear my mother's voice, proud and satisfied. Well done, my darling girl, well done. The girl who had been victimized, betrayed, and ultimately killed by her own family's cruelty was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had taken control of her own destiny, saved the life of a good man, and built a future filled with love and happiness. It was, I thought, as Alexander took my hand and smiled at me with complete adoration, exactly the ending we both deserved.